Good evening, everyone. I'm Hamiles, and today I'll be presenting my enterprise risk management analysis for Majidul Fatime. Here is the agenda for today's presentation. We will start with Majidul Fatime, its scale, the different businesses within the group, and how those businesses are connected. Then we'll look at the ERM framework, the governance structure, and the method used to identify and assess the risks. After that, we'll move on to the main risk areas. In each section, we'll look at the exposure connected with the examples from risk register and recent events, and then we'll explain how risk can be treated, transferred, or monitored. After that, we'll move on to the quantitative analysis section, including the interest rate gap, liquidity ladder, expected credit loss, and enterprise stress tests. And in the final section, we'll go through the board priorities, resilience, and business continuity. And then finally, we're going to conclude with monitoring opportunities and final recommendations. Before getting into risk analysis, let's understand the scale of Majidul Fatime. In 2025, the group generated almost 36 billion in revenue and more than 5 billion AED in EBITDA. It also had 12 billion in net debt, which gives us an important reference point for financial analysis later in the presentation. Operationally, MAF is spread across 14 countries with a large portfolio of malls, retail stores, hotels, and cinemas, as well as 10 million share members. So the purpose is just to establish and understand the size and breadth of the group before we start looking at different types of risk. Now that we understand the scale of the group, let's have a deeper look at the main businesses behind those numbers. The first part of MAF portfolio covers malls and asset management, communities and development, hotels, and grocery retail. Its mall portfolio includes major assets such as Mall of Emirates and City Center network. The development side includes projects such as Tilal Al Ghaf, Ghaf Woods, and Al Zahia. The group also owns hotel assets connected to its destinations, while the retail business includes Carrefour and several other grocery formats. The important point is that these businesses are very different from one another. A mall, a residential development, a hotel, and a grocery business don't carry the same risk, even though they all sit within the same group. MAF's portfolio extends further to entertainment, lifestyle, and digital solutions. On the entertainment side, MAF operates businesses such as Box Cinemas, Key Dubai, Snowman, and Magic Planet. Its lifestyle portfolio includes international brands such as Lululemon, Crate and Barrel, Lego, and Shiseido, etc. The digital solutions side includes Share, Precision Media, Global Solutions, and Innova. These businesses bring in a different set of risk. Entertainment depends heavily on footfall and customer experience. Lifestyle is more exposed to consumer demand and brand perception. And the digital side adds data, technology, and cyber risk. So we can see that the group's risk profile is much broader than the property and retail alone. This slide shows how MAF creates value, but also how one risk can move across the group. Retail contributes a larger share of revenue, while properties, hotels, and developments adds the recurring and future income. Entertainment, lifestyle, and share support the customer engagement across the wider portfolio. A good example of risk transmission is the cyber risk. A phishing email may begin with one employee, but if login details are compromised, the incident can reach systems used by Carrefour or Share. This can interrupt the payments or customer services, expose the data, create a regulatory issue, and eventually damage the customer trust. So the risk that starts as a technology problem quickly becomes an operational, legal, and reputational problem as well. Now, this is why MAF needs an enterprise-wide approach to risk. The group is managing very different exposures at the same time: public venues and life safety, food supply chains, major property and development projects, customer data, third-party operators, debt and financing, and operations across 14 countries. Each business unit can manage its own day-to-day risk, but many of the larger risks cut across several parts of the group. A cyber incident, a major property disruption, or a funding problem would not remain within one department or subsidiary. So ERM gives the management a single view of those exposure, so the risks can be managed together, escalated at the right level, and treated based on their impact on the whole group. Now that we understand the scale of MAF and why an enterprise-wide approach is needed, let's have a look at the framework and how it was structured. ISO 31000 was used as a main risk management process. It starts with understanding the context, then moves through the risk identification, analysis, evaluation, treatment, and then the ongoing monitoring. COSO links the risk to strategy and performance, so the management can see the risk as a part of decision making rather than a separate compliance exercise. The three lines model defines the responsibilities clearly. Business units own and manage the risk. Group risk reviews those risks, challenge the controls, and monitors the overall exposure. Internal audit independently tests whether the controls and frameworks are working well as intended. Above all three lines, the board sets the risk appetite, reviews the most significant exposures, and decide where the senior attention and fundings are required. Once the governance is clear, the framework also needs to show where MAF is willing to take the risk and where it's not. This slide separates four ideas. Risk capacity is what the group could absorb. Risk appetite is what it is prepared to accept. Risk tolerance is the permitted range around the appetite, and limits are the points that could trigger escalation. For this analysis, I haven't assigned one fixed number to MAF's total risk capacity because that would require internal information on liquidity headroom, insurance coverage, death covenants, and recovery capability. Instead, the appetite is set by the risk area. MAF should take very little risk in life safety, cyber security, liquidity, and compliance areas, while the development and innovation can operate within the wider limits as long as it is within the set thresholds and it's necessary for growth. Once the risk appetite part was clear, the next step was to identify the risks from different angles. Pastel showed the external pressures around MAF, such as economic changes, regulation, technology, and climate, etc. The segment review helped to separate the risk across different business areas because each business operates differently. The financial statement showed where financial pressure could build, for example, through debt, receivables, liquidity needs, or larger investment commitments. Process mapping then followed the activities such as supplier to shelf, then a tenant to rent, which helped to identify where delays, failures, or control gaps could occur. Recent incidents and third-party relationship added the practical side, especially around the cyber events, suppliers, contractors, and operators. Together, these methods produced 145 risks across 16 categories. So the risk identification process gave us 145 risks, 16 categories, 3 critical and 26 high. The full risk register is there in the Excel file, while in the presentation, we'll just focus on the main themes and what possible action management should take to mitigate those risks. After identifying the risks, the first step was to calculate the inherent score by multiplying the probability with impact. Probability measured how likely the event was based on frequency, current conditions, and exposure. Impact measured how serious the consequences could be across financial, operational, legal, and other areas. The second step was to assess the existing controls and determine the residual risk and the exposure that remained after the controls. The third step was to look beyond the score itself. This included the risk velocity, meaning how quickly the event could develop, the interconnection, how far it could spread, persistence means how long the effect could last, and detectability, how early the management could identify the risk. The final step was to compare the residual exposure with the appetite for that risk area and consider whether the proposed treatment justified its cost or not. This also gave us a clearer basis for monitoring, treatment, and escalation points. After the risk identification and risk assessment strategy, we'll move on to the main risk area now, and we'll start with the financial risks for now. Financial risks are categorized into three main areas, including market risk, credit risk, and liquidity risk. For MAF, market risk mainly comes from the interest rates, currencies, and changes in asset values. Because the group operates across several countries and carries significant debt, changes in the rates or exchange rates can affect its results quite quickly. For example, if Egyptian pound weakens, MAF may report lower revenue and EBITDA when it converts the Egyptian business back into dirhams. Imported goods may also become more expensive, which puts pressure on the margins. Credit risk is different. Here, the concern is whether the tenants, property buyers, or other counterparties will pay on time and in full. If a major tenant at Mall of Emirates starts missing repayments, MAF loses the rental income, the overdue balance becomes harder to recover, and the expected credit loss increases. If the tenant eventually leaves, MAF may also face the vacancy and replacement costs. Liquidity risk focuses on the timing. MAF may remain profitable, but it still needs enough cash available when the debt repayments, working capital needs, and the development costs are due. If a project runs over the budget or customer collections arrive later than usual, the pressure comes from the cash flow gap rather than the profitability alone. This is why each risk needs a different model. The repricing gap model measures the interest rate exposure, the liquidity radar shows whether the funding pressure may build, and the ECL model estimates the possible losses from unpaid receivables. And the next three slides will explain these models separately. Now, the earlier identified interest rate risk, we will convert it into something measurable in this slide. The first table shows the timing mismatch between MAF's rate-sensitive assets and liabilities. Because more liabilities than the assets could reprice in the first year, the model shows a negative gap of 8 billion. The second table converts the gap into possible financial impact. If the rate rises by 1%, finances cost could increase by 80 million. A 2% rise could increase them by around 160 million. These figures are illustrative and scale to MAF's public financial position since the full internal reprice schedule is not available. The value of the model is that it links the exposure to a decision. Once the management knows the gap where it sits and how large the impact could be, it can hedge a part of exposure through swaps, caps, and more fixed rate funding and better spread refinancing dates. Now let's move on to the contractual maturity ladder for liquidity risk. This model shows whether MAF's expected cash inflows can cover its obligation across different time periods. The first two columns shows the expected inflows and outflows. The net gap shows the shortfall in each period, while the cumulative gap shows how the shortfall builds over time. The key point is the 1 to 3 years period where the cumulative deficit reaches 3.9 billion. The position improves after that, but the model still ends up with a remaining gap of 0.9 billion. So the main issue here is not the immediate liquidity failure, but it's the concentration of funding pressure in the medium term when the debt repayments and investment commitments may fall due before enough cash could come in. All these figures are illustrative and are based on the MAF's public financial scale. This model helps the management to prepare early. MAF can refinance some debt before it falls due, keep the committed credit facilities available, maintain a minimum cash buffer, and postpone non-essential investment spending if the funding gap starts to widen. Now we move on to the credit risk, expected credit loss. This model estimates how much MAF could lose if the tenants, buyers, and other counterparties fail to repay. The table groups receivables by age. As the balance becomes more overdue, the probability of default rises and MAF may recover less of the amount outstanding. This is why the oldest balances create most of the expected credit loss. In this example, total exposure is 860 million, but the model estimates about 30 million of expected credit loss, with the largest share coming from receivables overdue for more than 180 days. Again, these figures are illustrative, but it helps the management to understand the riskiest balance first. MAF can tighten the credit limits, follow up on the overdue accounts earlier, and require the deposits or guarantees from weaker tenants and buyers. The three models showed that the market, credit, and liquidity risks behave differently, so MF cannot manage them with one solution and tool. For market risk, derivatives can help, swaps and caps can reduce the exposure to rising interest rates, while forwards and options can protect the future payments in foreign currencies. Credit risk needs stronger counterparty controls such as deposits, guarantees, limits, and earlier actions on overdue balances. Liquidity risk depends more on preparation, keeping committed facilities available, maintaining a cash buffer, and spreading debt maturities over time. So the treatment has to match the risk. Derivatives manage price movements, credit control reduces the chance of loss, and liquidity planning protects MEF's ability to meet its obligations. Now let's move on to the operational and digital risks. For MEF, this area covers failures in systems, people, and third-party services that can interrupt the normal day-to-day business activity. Because so many customer-facing operations rely on these elements, one failure can quickly affect the transaction, service delivery, and customer trust. For example, Carrefour depends on POS and inventory system. Share depends on the customer data. Malls, cinemas, and hotels rely on digital platforms for booking, payments, and daily operations. If one of those systems fails, the disruption can spread across several businesses and can disrupt the daily business activity. Here are some examples from the risk register, including the ransomware, weak frontline cyber awareness, system outages, and third-party failures, etc. Now, this slide shows how MAF can respond to each operational and digital risk using four choices: treat, transfer, tolerate, or terminate. The choices depends on the type and severity of the exposure. MAF can treat the risk by strengthening the controls, transfer part of the financial impact through insurance or contracts, tolerate only the raw residual risk within the appetite, and terminate activities or providers that create unacceptable exposure. So the important thing is that treatment should reflect how serious the risk is, how controllable it is, and whether the remaining exposure stays within the appetite or not. External and resilience risks. These risk areas come from the events outside of MEF's direct control. It includes pandemics, geopolitical disruptions, terrorism, major infrastructure failures, etc. MEF cannot prevent many of these events, but it can reduce how severely it affects its businesses. The Red Sea disruption is a good example. It begins as a geopolitical issue, but for MEF, it can increase the freight costs, delay the imported goods and construction materials, and can create shortages across retail and development. So the main issue here is not whether MAF can stop the event or not, it's whether the group is ready to continue operations when the event occurs or not. Now, this slide groups MAF sustainability exposure into physical climate, transition, resources, and disclosure risks. Physical climate is one of the most immediate because extreme weathers can disrupt the access, damage assets, and reduce the footfall for its businesses. Transition and disclosure risk develop more gradually through the higher compliance costs, changing standards, and the need to support the environmental claims with reliable data. At the same time, you can also see it creates some opportunities through energy efficiency, renewable power, and more resilient assets. The slide shows the treatment plan for external sustainability and resilience risks and KRIs to highlight when the controls are weakening. The key takeaway here is that MAF cannot prevent the external events, but it can control how exposed it is and how prepared it is for the risk. Strategic and governance risks. Unlike an operational failure, these risks may not create an immediate financial loss, but they can weaken MAF's license to operate, investor confidence, and long-term value. The slide highlights four main exposures: regulatory compliance across several jurisdictions, Sharia compliance in Islamic funding, poor capital allocation decisions, and reputational damage that can spread across the brands. So here is the treatment plan for strategic and governance risks. For compliance risk, the priority is stronger review, clear accountability, and regular board oversight. For investment decisions, MEF should test the projects in stages and stop funding when the expected return no longer justifies the risk. For reputational risk, the group needs accurate public reporting, early issue detection, and clear crisis report plan. The key takeaway is that these risks are controlled mainly through better governance and decisions only. The prioritization process combined the residual severity with frequency, velocity, and interconnectedness of the risks, so the board could focus on the risks that were not only large but also more likely to escalate and spread across the group. So this slide groups the board priorities into 5 broader themes and shows some examples. So the board can focus on the most significant and interconnected exposures, having greater potential to affect the business in several areas at the same time. Here is a comparison for gray rhino and black swan risks. Gray rhinos are the major threats that are already visible developing but can be managed through early action, while black swans are rare, unexpected events that require strong contingency planning and rapid response. The examples on this slide shows how both of these risks can affect MAF in very different ways. Here is an illustrative stress testing scenario. This scenario combined weaker retail revenue and development collections with higher freight and interest cost, and a major property disruption and a cyber incident altogether. Together, these shocks place around 380 to 780 million of quarterly EBITDA at risk, showing how several pressures can compound and create a much larger impact than any other one risk alone. So the stress test showed us how and what could go wrong. The business continuity plan shows how MAF would keep critical services running and restore them after disruption. The priority is to identify the services that cannot remain down, set clear recovery limits for each one, and test whether the backup systems, manual workarounds, and crisis teams can meet those requirements or not. The key measure of resilience is therefore not whether the disruption occurs or not, but whether MAF can contain it, protect the essential services, and return to normal operation within the required time or not. So the final step is to monitor whether the risk position is improving or deteriorating. The dashboard shows the most indicators remain within the acceptable levels, but cyber vulnerabilities and Red Sea freight pressure still needs attention. The same process also identifies these risks, so the capital can be directed towards the highest value areas, such as green finance, energy efficiency, and predictive maintenance, etc. So the ERM framework concluded with these 5 recommendations. The priority is to fund the cyber and operational resilience, use the financial models regularly in treasury decisions, embed the climate risk into investment decisions, reduce dependence on critical third parties, and review the KRIs and residual risks every quarter. So here is the list of sources used to support the ERM framework. And that's my AI acknowledgement. I'm happy to answer any questions.